You're watching the Everything Network. The Bonanno family had always carried a reputation that separated them from the rest of New York's underworld. Where other families projected brute power, theatrical violence, or political influence, the Bonannos built their empire on something quieter, more profitable, and far more dangerous. A drug pipeline that never truly shut down, even when official bosses insisted they wanted nothing to do with narcotics. It wasn't loud, it wasn't messy, and it wasn't always obvious, but it was there, humming beneath the city like a buried electric line, powering fortunes and feeding ambition long after the commission shouted, "No drugs," into cameras. And at the heart of that double-coded economy stood two men who lived in different eras but shared the same instinct. Philip "Rusty" Rastelli and Salvatore "Sal" the ironworker Montagna. Their lives never crossed directly. One ruled from the shadows of the 1970s and 1980s. The other tried to seize power in the 2000s. But the bloodstream of the family flowed through them in a way few men ever understood. Rastelli, the quiet architect who ran the family from prison for most of his reign, set the blueprint. Montagna, decades later, tried to inherit not just the chair but the very network that Rastelli's era built. A pipeline stretching from the alleys of New York to the ports of Montreal and across the ocean to the old world Sicilian suppliers whose hands never touched American soil, yet shaped the flow of heroin more deeply than any street soldier ever could. Montagna didn't need Rastelli alive to feel his presence. Every drug route he touched, every conversation whispered in Montreal cafes, every quiet handshake with Sicilian expats, they all carried Rastelli's fingerprints. The Bonanno drug economy wasn't something a single man created. It was something built up over time. And Sal Montagna wanted to take it to the top. To understand Montagna's ambition, you had to understand Montreal. Unlike New York, where the mafia had to dodge cops, informants, greedy rivals, and the unpredictable rhythm of a city that never slept, Montreal had a different energy. The port was looser, the customs oversight thinner, and the Sicilian underworld more deeply woven into immigrant neighborhoods. For decades, Montreal acted like a quiet valve through which product entered North America. Sometimes it was heroin, sometimes coke, sometimes precursor chemicals, but always flowing, always available, always one step removed from the manic spotlight of New York's law enforcement pressure. This backdrop, the one described in the histories of the men who shaped Montreal's underworld, created a playground for someone like Montagna, a Sicilian-born, hard-edged, physically imposing man with the temperament of someone who didn't flinch easily. He didn't move like the classic New York street guy. He carried himself with the controlled composure of a man raised around old-world discipline. His rise wasn't built on flash, but on reliability. Men trusted him because he showed up, worked hard, spoke little, and handled problems without needing applause for it. Yet beneath that composure lived the same ambition that drove every powerful mafioso. He wanted more than money. He wanted position, influence, control. And control in the Bonanno family had always been tied, directly or quietly, to the drug income. Rastelli once protected like a hidden crown jewel. Philip Rastelli's relationship with narcotics was the kind of contradiction that defined the mafia's fabric. Publicly, he enforced the commission's ban on drug dealing. Privately, he presided over an organization where heroin profits paid for lawyers, supported imprisoned soldiers' families, and stabilized the family's income during lean stretches. The hypocrisy wasn't unique. Every major family did the same. But the Bonannos excelled at it. Rastelli understood two truths. 1. Drugs were dangerous. 2. Drugs were unavoidable. Instead of pretending he could erase narcotics from the family, Rastelli developed a system where profit didn't depend on territory, but on access, connections, and quiet facilitation. He let certain crews, usually those with Sicilian ties or strong Montreal access, work in narcotics so long as they followed rules. No chaos, no publicity, no cowboy nonsense, and most importantly, kick up and keep the supply steady. This created a kind of shadow economy beneath the larger organization. Men who followed Rusty's rules could get rich quietly. Men who broke them could disappear quietly. For decades, this unspoken truth held the family together. Even when other families dealt with civil wars or aggressive bosses who overplayed their moves, the Bonannos maintained a steady internal rhythm thanks to Rastelli's restrained, prison-based guidance. And from this shadow economy came the Montreal pipeline, a network so delicate that only certain men were ever trusted to even speak about it. By the time Sal Montagna became active in New York, the official stance on drugs hadn't changed, but the story on the street had evolved. Instead of large, sprawling heroin rings, the Bonanno drug economy morphed into smaller, tighter supply chains. Instead of flashy dealers on corners, it leaned on couriers moving controlled product through trusted hands. Instead of visible profits, the money passed through quiet channels, gambling banks, construction kickbacks, repackaged cash flowing through small businesses. This is where Montagna fit in. He wasn't a drug boss in the traditional sense. He wasn't standing on street corners negotiating product. But he stood at the intersection between the old Sicilian mindset and the new North American networks. Men respected him because he came from the island. Older Sicilians saw him as someone who could bring discipline back to the family. Younger soldiers saw him as someone with access to a kind of power no New York guy could manufacture. Montagna carried the aura of someone tied to the international end of the business, not the street distribution, but the upstream connections, the places where real money flowed. Every Bonanno soldier knew the rule. The higher up you were on the supply chain, the more untouchable you became. And as Montagna rose, soldiers and captains alike moved closer to him, not because he handed out drugs, that wasn't his role, but because he offered something far more valuable. He opened the door to the Montreal and Sicilian networks that had fed the Bonanno family for decades. Access, opportunity, a pipeline to real profit. He didn't advertise it, he didn't boast about it, but the men who mattered understood it. The actual drug activity was handled by Bonanno soldiers who operated quietly under the umbrella that Montagna's connections provided. In this era, the one shaped by the lessons in the mob and the city and five families, street-level narcotics were fragmented but lucrative. Small teams in Queens and Brooklyn distributed product that didn't come through random dealers. It came through networks that were controlled, insulated, and carefully monitored. Montagna's influence didn't make them rich directly. It made the supply stable, which meant profit could flow uninterrupted. Some soldiers moved heroin, some moved cocaine, others specialized in pills or synthetic product. None of them operated with the recklessness of modern street gangs. They followed Rastelli's old principle: make money, don't make noise. Montagna's presence strengthened these operations because he had something most acting bosses didn't: credibility in Montreal and respect in Sicily. The Sicilian factions saw him as a bridge they could trust. Montreal crews saw him as the natural successor to the old networks that had tied the two cities together for decades. And New York soldiers saw him as a rising boss who could revive the family's identity. But power built on old-world respect and modern profit tends to create the same outcome: jealousy, suspicion, and conflict. When Montagna started making moves in New York, especially his attempt to edge into leadership after the Messino fallout, he didn't just challenge an existing hierarchy. He threatened the men who felt entitled to the power he was now accumulating. His Montreal ties gave him weight, his Sicilian roots gave him legitimacy, and his quiet, structured nature made him a natural fit for leadership. But in a post-Rastelli, post-Messino era, the Bonanno family had become allergic to certainty. Too many bosses had fallen, too many betrayals had scarred the family, too many indictments had reshaped the structure. Montagna saw opportunity. Others saw danger. He believed he could bring order. Others believed he was trying to consolidate the drug pipeline under himself. He saw leadership. They saw takeover. And in the world the mafia built, the world where money often mattered more than blood, seeing the wrong thing in a man could get him killed. Montagna's rise happened at a time when the Bonanno family was suffering from fractured leadership. The Messino collapse left power scattered like broken glass across multiple crews. There were acting captains stepping in for imprisoned ones, aging soldiers trying to reclaim former positions, and newer men looking for guidance from someone who could bring consistency. Montagna offered all of that, but with every step he took, resistance grew. The seeds of conflict were planted in 3 places. 1. The older Bonanno captains, especially those who remembered the Rastelli era, didn't like the idea of a Sicilian-born Canadian pushing into the seat. They believed leadership should stay with men who built their reputations on New York soil, not Montreal snow. 2. Certain drug-connected crews feared losing their autonomy. Montagna's rising influence over the Montreal pipeline meant he could decide who got access and who got cut out. Men who profited under loosely controlled networks didn't want a new gatekeeper. 3. Rival factions in Montreal saw his attempts to unify the New York-Montreal connection as a threat to their local dominance. They didn't care about New York politics. They cared about protecting their side of the ocean. Montagna walked into a 3-front war without declaring one. And in the mafia, you rarely survive a war you didn't know you were already fighting. What made Montagna unique, and ultimately vulnerable, was his refusal to play politics. He believed strength came from structure, discipline, and respect. He carried himself with the old-world firmness that worked in Sicily and Montreal, but often clashed with the unpredictable egos of New York crews that had been running without solid leadership for years. He expected men to fall in line. They expected him to negotiate. He pushed forward. They pushed back. Montagna saw the Bonanno family as something he could restore. The men around him saw something they needed to control. And the drug economy, the quiet bloodstream Rastelli once managed, became the unspoken battlefield. Montagna wanted to consolidate influence. Others wanted to prevent consolidation. Soldiers wanted access. Captains wanted autonomy. And all of them knew that whoever controlled the Montreal-New York drug valve controlled the shape of the family's future. Montagna believed he could be that man. Others believed no one should be. And when belief turns into fear, fear turns into conspiracy. And conspiracy, in this life, turns into action. The moment Salvatore Montagna stepped deeper into the power vacuum of the Bonanno family, the world of Montreal and New York began vibrating with a kind of tension that didn't show itself in shootouts or street-level chaos. Instead, it seeped quietly through meeting rooms, whispered conversations, and a dozen hidden channels that carried messages from borough to borough and from city to city. To the outside world, Montagna's rise seemed almost clean. A Sicilian-born, Montreal-raised ironworker stepping into the fractured remains of a once organized hierarchy. But beneath the quiet surface was a web of conflicts waiting to ignite. The Bonanno family had survived Messino's collapse, but it had not healed from it. Authority was scattered, loyalty was conditional, and money, especially drug money, traveled through back channels no single man controlled. Montagna believed he could impose order. The underworld believed he was trying to take too much too fast. And in the mafia, speed kills. The trouble started when Montagna began pushing his influence into the very heart of the Bonanno family, the crews that handled the drug-related revenue streams Rastelli had once managed with silent precision. These were not street dealers. These were men who controlled access to suppliers, managed middlemen, and ensured product moved from Montreal's ports to the hands of experienced distributors in Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. Montagna didn't have to say he wanted control. The men around him felt it. His background gave him leverage. He was Sicilian-born. He had Montreal ties. He had old-world respect. He had international credibility. And he had the calm, structured personality of a man who expected authority. To soldiers and captains who lived knee-deep in Brooklyn and Queens rackets, this was both impressive and terrifying. A man like Montagna didn't just influence drug routes, he could dominate them. And for the first time in years, the pipeline that Rastelli's era had built, that flow of narcotics and profit sliding quietly from Montreal to New York, was at risk of falling under one man's command. This terrified the power players. Not because they opposed Montagna, but because they feared what any single man could do with that kind of access. Under a fractured leadership, no one crew controlled too much. Under Montagna's leadership, that balance would shift. And the men who depended on the drug economy to survive weren't ready to give up their slice. Montagna's real trouble began not in New York, but in the fractured, ego-driven world of Montreal's mafia. A world built on a delicate web of alliances between Sicilians, Calabrians, independent clans, and businessmen who had one foot in the underworld and one foot in legitimate enterprise. He entered Montreal thinking he could restore order. He didn't realize the war had already started without him. When he stepped into the vacuum left by the weakened Rizzuto crime family, whose power had been throttled by arrests, murders, and internal betrayal, Montagna believed he was doing what any Sicilian with ambition would do, trying to unify a fragmented empire. But unifying Montreal was like trying to stack broken glass. The first faction to oppose him was the Desjardins faction, a hybrid crew of French-Canadian and Sicilian-connected men who had been waiting for someone like Montagna to overextend himself. They didn't see him as a savior. They saw him as a foreign invader, a man coming from New York to dictate terms in a territory they believed belonged to them. And behind them simmered the resentment of other Montreal factions, small groups dangerous in their own ways, all fearful of being marginalized by a disciplined, Sicilian-backed leader with New York authority. Where New York saw Montagna as a threat to the drug pipeline, Montreal saw him as a threat to their autonomy. He walked into the storm believing he could lead. They believed he had declared war. As tensions grew, Montagna made a mistake that was more cultural than strategic. He approached Montreal like Sicily, expecting respect, seeking order, and assuming his reputation would carry weight. But Montreal's underworld wasn't Sicily. It wasn't New York either. It was a hybrid world born from immigration, geography, and the criminal economy described in the histories of the city. Cocaine routes from the Caribbean, heroin from Europe, ecstasy and synthetics from new labs driven by modern demand. It was diverse, fast-moving, and driven less by tradition and more by opportunity. Montagna's old-world discipline clashed violently with men who preferred loose structures and quick money. And as he pushed harder into the power vacuum, the pipeline became the battlefield. Every man with access to the Montreal drug supply, whether heroin, cocaine, or synthetics, began to fear that Montagna's rise would choke their autonomy. He wasn't even controlling the drug flow yet. But the possibility that he could was enough. At the same time, back in New York, Bonanno captains began whispering. They didn't mind an acting boss, but they feared an acting boss with cross-border influence. A man who could unite Montreal and New York narcotics under one umbrella was a man they couldn't control. Montagna's strength became his curse, too Sicilian for Brooklyn crews, too New York for Montreal factions, too disciplined for the modern era, too connected for the insecure, too ambitious for the cautious, too quiet for the loud, too strong for the weak. He became a mirror reflecting everyone's fears. Whether he wanted it or not, Sal Montagna was seen as a conqueror, and conquerors are rarely tolerated. The Montreal conflict came to a violent head when Montagna attempted to force certain factions into compliance. He wasn't trying to provoke war, he was trying to create structure. But in a city where every crew was already on edge, structure felt like strangulation. Meetings turned tense, Allies became undecided. Undecided men became informants. Informants fed fear. Fear fed action. In the end, it wasn't New York that killed Sal Montagna, it was Montreal. He was drawn into negotiations, lured into conversations that should have stabilized the situation, and instead found himself surrounded by men who believed peace could only be achieved with him gone. The killing was not theatrical, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't even symbolic, it was practical. They eliminated him. They eliminated him the same way they eliminated anyone who threatened their financial arteries. Quietly, efficiently, brutally. A shot, a chase, a dying man collapsing in icy water. A life built on silence ended in silence. Salvatore Montagna, the man who thought he could unite the Montreal and New York underworld, died because he tried to bring order to men who hated the very idea of it. Montagna's death didn't end the fight. It opened the floodgates. The Montreal drug pipeline, the artery that had fed the Bonannos for decades, splintered into smaller hands the moment he died. What had once been a unified flow under the Rizzutos and then a contested flow under Montagna became a mosaic of smaller operations, fragments of the old Rizzuto network, independent Sicilian operators, corrupt port workers, opportunistic Calabrian crews, hybrid French-Canadian groups, and even non-traditional criminal entrepreneurs who knew how to exploit new synthetic market. Montagna had tried to grab a single steering wheel. His death turned the steering wheel into 6 pieces. Back in New York, Bonanno soldiers who had relied on Montagna's access found themselves scrambling. Some tried to forge their own connections in Montreal, but without a strong, respected figure like Montagna to vouch for them, they were treated as foreign intruders. Others shifted their operations to domestic suppliers. A few abandoned the drug game entirely, unwilling to take risks in a post-Montagna environment where alliances were unpredictable and betrayals more common. And quietly, hidden from the immediate chaos, a new force began testing the pipeline. After Montagna's death, the first group to make serious moves toward the Montreal, New York supply chain wasn't a single boss or a unified faction. It was a collection of smaller Montreal players, many of whom had worked under the Rizzuto umbrella but never had the chance to control anything themselves. These groups, loosely organized but highly motivated, began slicing off pieces of the pipeline like scavengers around a fallen animal. None of them wanted to dominate the entire network. They wanted to control enough to stay rich, enough to stay protected, and enough to keep New York dependent but not dominant. In this environment, the man who came closest to consolidating power was Reynald Desjardins. Not officially, not ceremonially, but practically. Desjardins was already a key figure in the anti-Montagna faction. He had the contacts, the experience, and the cunning. He knew the port, he knew the suppliers, he knew the men who feared Montagna's rise. And he understood something Montagna did not. Montreal didn't want a boss. Montreal wanted a broker. And Desjardins began filling that role, quietly, incrementally, strategically. He didn't become a king. He became the man people had to talk to. And in the underworld, that's often more powerful than being the man who gives orders. Meanwhile, New York tried to rebuild its access points. The Bonanno family still had buyers. They still had distributors. They still had soldiers who needed the income. But the clean, structured pathway Montagna tried to establish was dead. In its place was a fractured supply chain that required negotiation, caution, and multiple intermediaries. Montagna's dream of order had turned into a labyrinth. Back in Queens and Brooklyn, Bonanno drug earners adapted by developing more decentralized operations. They relied on smaller shipments, more trusted couriers, and more fluid arrangements. Some captains shifted to cocaine because the supply chain was less politically explosive. Others stuck with heroin because the profits were higher, even if the risks were sharper. The drugs kept moving, the money kept flowing. But the stability Montagna tried to forge remained shattered. By the time the dust settled, one truth became clear. The Montreal, New York drug pipeline did not die with Sal Montagna. It simply changed ownership. Instead of a single gatekeeper, it became a marketplace governed by Reynald Desjardins, smaller Sicilian operators, remnants of the Rizzuto network, corrupt port insiders, opportunistic middlemen, and a few Bonanno-connected suppliers who built new relationships quietly. It didn't become weaker, it became more chaotic. And chaos, in the underworld, always leads to new wars or new opportunities. Montagna's death didn't close a chapter, it opened one. And the next man to try to control the pipeline would face the same choice. Montagna faced, unify it or die trying. When Salvatore Montagna fell in the icy waters of Repentigny, Montreal didn't react with shock, it reacted with calculation. His death didn't settle the conflict, it detonated the starting gun for a scramble that had been building quietly for years. Montagna wasn't just a man, he was a potential bridge between two criminal universes, the New York Bonannos and the fragmented Sicilian and Canadian world of Montreal. When he died, that bridge collapsed. The immediate aftermath didn't look like a mob war. There weren't shootouts or public executions. Instead, phones rang, intermediaries traveled, and whisper networks ballooned overnight as every crew, faction, and opportunistic group tried to determine one thing: who controls the flow now? Because the drug pipeline, the same artery Rastelli once protected from prison walls and Montagna tried to resurrect through Sicilian discipline, could not survive without someone filling the vacuum. But the pipeline was no longer a single stream. It had fractured into tributaries, heroin here, cocaine there, synthetics from unexpected laboratories, precursor chemicals moving in ways even seasoned gangsters struggled to track. Montagna had tried to unite these streams. His death unleashed them. And the new war began not with bullets, but with conversations, with claims, with quiet maneuvering by men who understood that whoever set the rules first would own the next decade. The first man to move was Reynald Desjardins, not because he wanted to be boss, but because he understood the mechanics better than anyone left standing. Desjardins wasn't Sicilian royalty, but he was a respected strategist, a hybrid operator who spoke the language of French-Canadian factions while maintaining deep ties to Sicilian-born networks. He didn't need ceremony, he didn't need a title, he needed leverage. And after Montagna died, leverage was the only commodity worth anything. Desjardins acted like a broker. He became the unofficial center point that smaller factions contacted when they needed access to port workers, trusted middlemen, or connections to old European suppliers. His strength was his neutrality. He wasn't trying to dominate, he was trying to maintain relevance. And relevance, in the underworld, often becomes power before anyone notices. But Desjardins wasn't the only one hungry for influence. Other factions saw the opening too. Remnants of the Rizzuto organization. Independent Sicilian players who had never accepted New York interference. Smaller Montreal crews with Caribbean cocaine ties. Hybrid gangs with no respect for tradition, only profit. Business-minded middlemen who saw the drug trade as numbers, not heritage. Montagna's structure-driven model was dead. In its place rose a free market battlefield. Each group carved off a piece of the pipeline. None of them controlled all of it. All of them believed they could eventually. Across the border, in New York, the Bonanno family felt the shock. For years, they had relied, quietly, unofficially, on the Montreal connection to stabilize the drug profits that certain crews still depended on. Even if heroin was no longer the empire builder it once was, the pipeline remained a lifeline for earners who needed consistent product. With Montagna gone, they were cut loose. The first reaction among Bonanno captains was panic, though they didn't show it. Nobody panicked openly in the mafia. But there was a shift, a tightening, a sharpening, as captains began assessing their options. Some attempted to form relationships directly in Montreal, bypassing intermediaries. Others turned inward, focusing on domestic supply. A few pushed soldiers into alternative rackets, gambling, loans, offshore scams, credit card fraud rings influenced by modern technology. But the men who relied on narcotics knew the truth. Without a Montreal anchor, they needed a new strategy. And that responsibility fell into the hands of Michael Mancuso, the quiet, calculating leader who inherited the chaos Montagna left behind. Mancuso understood something vital. A modern mob family cannot dominate the drug trade, but it cannot survive without it either. So his approach wasn't to replace Montagna, it was to neutralize the dependency Montagna created. He didn't try to control the pipeline, he tried to dilute its importance. Under Mancuso's watch, 3 things happened. 1. Decentralization of drug operations. Captains were encouraged to rely on smaller suppliers and avoid consolidating shipments. Instead of large, risky loads, crews dealt in multiple smaller transactions. Less profit per deal, but less exposure. 2. A shift toward domestic sources. New York crews began relying on homegrown networks, local distributors, Caribbean intermediaries, operating through city neighborhoods, and even Middle Eastern groups with synthetic drug access. 3. A new rule. No man becomes the gatekeeper. Mancuso had watched Montagna's rise and fall closely. He knew that giving one man, any man, too much control over narcotics created risk. So he made sure no soldier, no captain, no faction could monopolize the pipeline. This wasn't a moral decision. It was survival strategy. But while New York rebuilt, Montreal descended deeper into competition. In the new landscape, 3 groups attempted what Montagna had failed to complete, controlling the flow of narcotics between the port, the streets, and the international suppliers. 1. The Desjardins Network, the brokers. Desjardins became the organizer, but not the commander. His pragmatic, business-minded approach made him the de facto coordinator of port insiders, corrupt customs workers, and mid-level traffickers. His group didn't care about the Bonannos. They cared about efficiency and profit. Number 2. The Rizzuto survivors, the Loyalists. The Rizzuto crime family didn't die, it scattered. The remaining Loyalists, hardened, scarred, and deeply connected, began reclaiming pockets of influence. They didn't want to rule Montreal anymore. They wanted to maintain the parts of the pipeline they had always owned: heroin from Europe, coke from South America. They were smaller now, but their roots were deep. 3. The new generation players. These were men Montagna never understood. Younger, hybrid, multi-ethnic crews who didn't care about old rules or Sicilian honor. They moved product through modern methods: encrypted networks, online marketplaces, synthetic alternatives. They didn't need New York approval. They didn't need Montreal's old hierarchy. All they needed was supply. They were dangerous because they were unpredictable. They were profitable because they were innovative. And they were impossible to regulate. These were the men who represented the future of the pipeline, not in volume, but in adaptability. Back in New York, the Bonanno family had to restructure not only its drug economy, but its identity. With Montagna dead, Mancuso, Santora, while he remained active, and the senior captains shaped the next era around 3 key principles. A. Stability over expansion. The family would not attempt to take over anything in Montreal. That era was gone. Montagna's death proved that New York men were no longer welcome as leaders there. B. Quiet earnings over flashy operations. Instead of large drug organizations, the family leaned into smaller mutuo operations, fast-moving money schemes, construction skims, gambling pools, and cyber-era extortion. Less profit individually, more stability collectively. C. No more born messiahs. Montagna's Sicilian pedigree had made him appealing, even charismatic. But the family learned that men who came with international reputations also came with international enemies. New York needed New Yorkers now, men who understood the surveillance climate, the informant era, and the caution required to avoid federal takedowns. Montagna's fall became a lesson. No single man should ever again hold the keys to an international pipeline. So who took over the pipeline? There was no single successor. There couldn't be. Instead, control broke into layers. At the top, international suppliers and old-world Sicilians who maintained influence but avoided direct contact with anyone in North America. In Montreal, Desjardins became the unofficial broker. Rizzuto remnants retained sections of the older heroin and cocaine connections. New generation crews controlled new synthetic routes. In New York, the Bonannos adapted, shifting away from dependency and surviving through a diversified portfolio of smaller drug contacts and non-drug rackets. No more empires, only ecosystems. No more kings, only brokers. Montagna wanted to rebuild the old world. Instead, he left behind a new one, fragmented, unpredictable, and ruled by negotiation rather than rank. But his death didn't close the story. It opened a new chapter in the drug axis between Montreal and New York, one where the Bonannos remained present but no longer dominant, and where men like Desjardins shaped the flow without ever claiming a title. And in that vacuum, a new generation of traffickers began to rise, men who grew up long after Rastelli died and Montagna fell. In the years following Sal Montagna's death and the collapse of his attempted unification, the Bonanno family found itself standing at a crossroads more severe than anything it had faced in its long, turbulent history. The drug pipeline that had fed their deepest pockets, from Rastelli's regulated hidden economy to Montagna's attempted resurrection, was broken into fragments they no longer controlled. And the world outside had changed in ways no old boss could have predicted. New York was no longer the city that once allowed organized crime to hide in plain sight. There were cameras where payphones used to be, digital footprints where cash envelopes once erased everything, encrypted communications replacing whispered conversations in back rooms, a generation raised on technology replacing a generation raised on omerta. The Bonanno family had a choice: chase the past and collapse chasing ghosts, or adapt. Survival demanded the latter. The first transformation came under Michael Mancuso, but it didn't end with him. His quiet, almost ghost-like management style became the blueprint for survival in a world where flamboyant bosses ended up on front-page indictments before their morning coffee finished brewing. Under this new structure, the Bonannos stopped trying to be kings. They focused on being shadows. They didn't attempt to rule industries anymore. They infiltrated fragments of them. They didn't control the pipeline. They tapped into pieces of it cautiously. They didn't move weight. They moved opportunity, the kind that slipped between cracks most people didn't see. This shift didn't happen overnight. It evolved through necessity. As Montagna's connections scattered, and Montreal became a battlefield of freelancers and hybrid groups, the Bonannos realized the era of relying on a Sicilian-born power figure or a foreign pipeline was gone forever. The world that allowed Rastelli to quietly influence narcotics from a prison cell and that allowed Montagna to negotiate with Montreal factions had evaporated. Globalization had changed the drug trade. Law enforcement had changed surveillance. The internet had changed everything else. To survive in this new world, the Bonannos adapted their hierarchy. The modern Bonanno family became smaller, leaner, more mobile. A family built not on grand schemes, but on dozens of small, steady hustles. They shifted from centralization to compartmentalization, a structure where each crew operated like a miniature crime cell, self-contained, insulated, and independent from the others. This protected the whole family from collapsing when one group fell. In the Montagna era, the hope was that one strong leader could unify networks. In the post-Montagna era, the smartest move was making sure no leader ever held enough power to destroy them again. Crews developed specialties. 1. Cyber-age fraud and financial manipulation. Not sophisticated Wall Street schemes, but stolen identities, credit card operations, ATM skimmers, unemployment fraud, and online resale scams. This was the new, noisy money that criminals a generation younger than Montagna excelled at. 2. Gambling, the eternal backbone. Sports betting surged, fueled by apps, offshore servers, and digital processing. A Bonanno bookmaker could now run a full operation with nothing more than a laptop, a burner phone, and a dozen frustrated gamblers trying to chase losses. 3. Construction, trucking, and service industries. Not domination, infiltration. Not unions, vendors. Not rackets, relationships. A few key captains built ties to contractors, waste removal companies, small subcontractors, and repair services. No headlines, no turf wars, just recurring profit. 4. Small-scale narcotics, local and fragmented. No more grand Montreal shipments, no more Sicilian orchestration. Just small volumes of product obtained through local brokers or domestic suppliers. Not glamorous, but dependable. This wasn't the drug economy Rastelli built. It wasn't the pipe dream Montagna tried to resurrect, but it was manageable, and most importantly, survivable. For the older generation, this transition felt like humiliation. Men who once dreamed of controlling ports now supervised mid-level earners trafficking street-level pills. Men who once commanded international respect now negotiated with digital-age hustlers who had never heard of the commission. Men who once believed in honor and heritage now dealt with the cynical reality that the underworld had become democratized. Anyone with a smartphone and a willingness to break the law could run a racket. But for the younger generation, the ones who came of age long after the commission fought its last real battles, this new model offered something the old one couldn't: flexibility. Gone were the days when a single FBI indictment wiped out half a family. Now each crew's fall affected only itself. Gone were the days when soldiers needed international connections to make real money. Now they needed creativity and a willingness to evolve. Gone were the days when younger associates waited 20 years for a button. Now they earn their place by generating profit in a digital world the old-timers barely understood. The Bonannos weren't the mafia of Rastelli or the Sicilian era. They were an urban network, part traditional, part modern, surviving through quiet consistency rather than dominance. Still, the family could not entirely abandon tradition. Certain rituals remained: meetings in diners, handshakes, envelopes, the old commandments whispered between generations. A soldier still needed sponsorship. A captain still needed tribute. Respect still flowed upward. But everything was stripped down. Less ceremony, more practicality. The family stopped trying to imitate their former glory. They focused on staying alive. When internal disputes arose, they resolved them with caution. When an associate made too much noise, they cut him loose instead of cutting him down. When a captain grew too ambitious, the hierarchy reminded him what happened to men like Montagna, men who tried to reshape the world instead of working within the shadows of the one that remained. The family became defined by survival through modesty. Modest rackets, modest earnings, modest ambitions. But modesty was a strategy, not a weakness. Because while other criminal groups expanded recklessly into territory guaranteed to draw federal heat, the Bonannos learned how to operate beneath the radar. Even without a strong pipeline, the family still had something powerful: reputation. Not the flamboyant reputation once held by the Gambinos, or the political influence once wielded by the Genovese, but reputation in the sense of legacy. A name that still meant something in the alleys of Brooklyn, the cafes of Howard Beach, the small clubs where older men remembered the past. A Bonanno associate didn't need to threaten anyone. His lineage did that for him. The family name was a silent weapon. And in a world run by people who fear being scammed or exposed, a silent weapon is sometimes the strongest. The aftermath of Montagna's death taught the Bonannos 3 permanent lessons. Lesson 1. Never depend on a foreign pipeline again. Montreal could be a partner. It could never again be a foundation. Lesson 2. Leadership should be quiet, consistent, and nearly invisible. Bosses who make headlines don't stay bosses. Bosses who live like shadows live longest. Lesson 3. The future belongs to the flexible, not to the strongest, not to the most traditional, not to the most feared, but to the ones who can adapt, the ones who move with the city, not against it. And that is how the Bonanno family entered the modern era, as a mosaic of small operations, tied together by history, adapting to a world that had outgrown their old model, yet still surviving in the cracks where the law, technology, and desperation met. Not kings, not rulers, not international bosses, survivors. In the shadows of a city that once feared them, the Bonannos learned how to exist in a new way, one that Rastelli could never have imagined, and Montagna never lived long enough to see. But they're still there, smaller, quieter, harder to find, harder to kill, and quietly waiting, because in the underworld, nothing stays still forever.